Hi, everyone. Welcome back to our monthly webinar series, Conversations on Character and the Common Good. This is our final conversation for 2024. This webinar series is part of Virtues and Vocations, a national forum that is housed at the Institute for Social Concerns at the University of Notre Dame and supported by the Kern Family Foundation. I'm Suzanne Shanahan, and I direct the Institute for Social Concerns and am host for this series. Virtues and Vocations seeks to foster a community of practice amongst scholars and practitioners across disciplines who are keen to understand how best to cultivate character and moral purpose in higher education and the professions. This webinar series is one way we facilitate this conversation. Today, I am thrilled to bits to be able to introduce Dr. Sanford Sandy Shugart, who will be joining us for a conversation on leadership, character, and higher education. Sandy has served for more than 40 years in higher education, 30 of them as president. He has focused on high access institutions and their transformation into high success, learning-centered colleges. He led Valencia College in Orlando, Florida, which was recognized as the first winner of the Aspen Prize for Excellence and was recognized with the McCraw Prize in Higher Education and by Washington Monthly as one of the 10 most innovative colleges and university presidents in the country. Sandy's approach to transformation proceeds from what he calls a sacred anthropology, deeply informed by his Christian faith, yet accessible to secular institutions seeking to serve persons more powerfully. Sandy currently serves as a senior fellow with the Aspen Institute's College Excellence Program, coaching college presidents from across the country. He is also a senior fellow with the Quo Vadis Institute in Salzburg, Austria, writing and speaking on faithful frameworks for engaging emerging societal changes. Sandy is an active musician, poet, and author, most recently of Leadership in the Crucible of Work, Discovering the Interior Life of an Authentic Leader. We are thrilled to have you here, Sandy. Welcome.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, as usual, we're going to proceed somewhat informally, but I would love you to give us just a bit of background, where you're from, what your educational background is, and how it took you to this life of leadership in higher education.
Yeah. So, grew up in a kind of an unusual, very musical family, lived kind of all over the country and a little bit overseas. Had my intellectual fires lit early at this really amazing school in Southwest England as a teenager. Came back to the States and went to the University of North Carolina and then had a conversion there as a freshman. And that's still like the signal moment of my journey. And University Christian Fellowship nurtured me as a rough cob, brand new, keep them out of the limelight Christian. And I spent most of the rest of my life trying to connect my intellectual and my spiritual life in ways that were productive for the kingdom. I majored in chemistry, not because I wanted to be a chemist, but because I was interested in truth claims, and thought I might be a philosopher of science. I at least was really interested in it, and in the peculiar modes of inquiry that science uses to get at certain kinds of truth claims. And taught for a little bit, went back to graduate school and stumbled into a part-time job and a doctorate, neither one of which were really high on my agenda. And the job was working as a policy advisor to a governor for a period of time. And then again, just providentially got hired as the chief academic officer of the community college system in North Carolina at the tender age of 26, never having been on a community college campus but once. So I was thrown into the deep end with sharks, and that turned out to be just one of those incredible experiences that God gives us, where you learn more than you thought you possibly could, both about the world and about yourself. And since that time, knew what my project in the world was, and still pursuing it.
That's wonderful. So, I would love to talk a bit about your most recent book on leadership. So, um, and seeing this new book on leadership, I was reminded of a conversation we had last year with Middlebury president Lori Patton. And at some point in the conversation, I said, "Oh, you should write a book on leadership." And she said, "Oh, no, no. The one thing I promised myself was when I stepped down from being president, I would never write a book on leadership." And she said, "So many people do that." And she said, "I don't know what to do with them." And so I had that in mind when I picked up your book. And I have to say, I so enjoyed it. I think you're bringing a very just a really great perspective to it, but that you have intermingled poetry into the book as a way to illustrate particular points, I found just extraordinary. And so much of the poetry is actually your own poetry. And I think this just made it truly, truly special as a read. So I'd love to kind of jump in and I'm going to grab the book because there's a quote I wanted to start with. Um, so the book begins with a story of your own sort of crucible of work, which I really appreciated the humility you brought and really sort of carried through the entire book.
Speaker, poet, and college president.
So I have apologies to folks. I have a new Zoom that decides to do things that it wants without asking. I guess that's the future of AI. We'll make decisions for us all.
Artificial
What's gonna happen on Zoom.
unintelligence. Yeah.
Yeah, so there we go. But it's this great Studs Terkel quote. And at the Institute for Social Concerns, one of our core areas is the work of labor, and we do a whole lot around the dignity of work. And you have this just phenomenal Studs Terkel quote, which is, "This book, being about work, is by its very nature about violence, to the spirit as well as to the body. It is about ulcers as well as accidents, about shouting matches as well as fistfights, about nervous breakdowns as well as kicking the dog around. It is above all or beneath all about daily humiliation. To survive the day is a triumph enough for the walking wounded among the great many of us." And I wonder if you could talk about why this quote is so important to kicking off your particular perspective of leadership and higher education and the moral purpose of what we're all engaged in.
Yeah. Well, I should be fair to Studs Terkel. That quote is followed with a much more hopeful next sentence. But I think my journey really began, that turning point for me was when I realized that I was turning into somebody that I didn't want to be, and that was happening to me through success, actually, at work. And a colleague helped me see who I was turning into. And she's a dear friend, and I'll never be able to thank her enough. And I had to step back and say, what in the world is going on here? I'm becoming, in my character, a human being I used to make fun of and despise. And I realized in that moment, boy, all those people, the old burned out husks of human beings that we made fun of as young people after work over a beer, started out pretty much like me. And they also were being deformed by their work over time. And so for me, the great insight was, Suzanne, that we're formed more powerfully by our work than we form it. That the tools we use, the habits of thought, the systems that we routinely employ, the way we think about the persons around us and the persons we don't see who are vital to our work, like customers or students or whatever, that those habits and processes, the cultures of the organizations, the processes, procedures, all those things are shaping us as we use them. Sort of like the handle of a hammer, the shapes the hand of a carpenter over our lifetime. And that many people are deformed by those experiences because work is a part of a fallen world. Remember, the curse in the Genesis story isn't on work, it's on fruitlessness. Cursed is the ground because of your failure here. And so toil is what the curse is. Work that's not fruitful. Work has many consequences. And one of them is, be careful, you're turning into somebody while you do it. And you might want to be aware and look for a way to make it formative rather than deforming. And that's been, I mentioned the project of my life. That's sort of been the project of my life. I didn't wake up in the morning and say, I'd like to be a leader of a big, complex organization. It just happened to me. And when I realized first that I was turning into somebody doing the image of a crucible from my chemistry training came out to me. And this is a place where you perform reactions that are so powerful, they would shatter an ordinary flask. So heat, pressure, reactivity, maybe corrosive byproducts in a crucible. And I thought, well, that sounds like a lot of staff meetings to me. So that's the metaphor that presented itself. And I began to look for a way to enter the crucible, which you can't avoid, and not be deformed. And of course, I was so young that it was all about me. After a little while, I realized, oh, wait a minute, as a senior leader, I'm actually forming the crucible for all these other people. And that's when the work got serious. And the book came out of journal entries I made over 15, 20 years as a senior leader, the first half of my career, where I deeply wanted to engage in an experiment in creating work lives that were nourishing instead of depleting, where people were enlarged instead of diminished by what they do, and where they came home at the end of the day feeling like they were on a journey instead of in a rat race. And with the hypothesis that kind of wholesomeness in our work actually produced better mission as well. That to go to Robert Greenleaf's hypothesis, servant institutions are only successful if they practice servanthood in themselves as well as for their clients. So that's been the project, and it came out of that kind of realization, which of course I've had over and over again. One thing about looking in the mirror is you never know what you'll see.
So let me ask you the extent to which this way of thinking is particular to your work in higher education, or are there ways in which this logic is better, worse, translated into higher education settings?
Yeah. So I think it's particularly interesting in higher ed. And higher ed is an interesting laboratory for that project for me. I love community colleges. I love universities too, but I especially loved community colleges because they're young enough and their mission is still clearly enough defined that they're less tempted to be totally self-absorbed. And most of higher education can't look away from the mirror. They just can't. They're just completely in love with themselves and are completely certain that they are an evident good to everybody that they come near. And we should give them our money and our children and the future of our society. We should just give it to them in faith. And they can't help it. Community colleges are a little less that way. They're getting that way, but it's mostly just a function of their youth. So it's been a great laboratory for me, and useful because they are complex servant institutions. And we can struggle with institutions that don't have a servant ethic to begin with. The work seems harder there to me. But I thought if the experiment can't work in a servant institution, it can't work anywhere. So for me, it was the right starting point. I found over time that the notions of of formation through work and the kinds of work communities that we fashion together seems to be deeply appealing to people in lots of other enterprises.
Yeah, yeah.
And Greenleaf never limited his work to explicitly servant institutions. He would say the for-profit world works on servanthood. It just doesn't like the language.
That's great. So in thinking about this argument that you're making, one of the questions I had is about the importance of the ethos in community colleges. And if you could talk a little bit more about that. I don't know if you read the recent David Brooks piece on how elite colleges sort of ruined America. But I do think they are this extraordinary space. And maybe you could talk a little bit about why that space is so important to the ecosystem and how you use that as a laboratory to do much of the work that you did over your lifetime.
Yeah. So I think I could give a good sociological and political argument for community colleges, but many others have done that and do it better than I. I think the short version of that is this is where most of America goes to college. And if it doesn't succeed, where the growing divide between haves and have-nots is going to be insurmountable. And that, to quote one famous thinker, diamonds, this is Jefferson, diamonds will be right from the coals. Now, you're just as likely to find genius, real potential on the wrong side of the tracks as the right side. But we don't have a way of serving them. Higher education's become more of a sifter of attributes that people have acquired culturally and otherwise than it is the developer of talent, I'm afraid. That's a controversial conversation in and of itself. But to skip that controversy and move on, I would say what I love best about community colleges is that I can ask the hard questions there about the underlying anthropology of our work, and they're still answerable and real to people in their everyday practice. And that may not be true in some other more complicated institutions with a broader portfolio of businesses to manage.
Great. Can you talk a little bit more about this notion of anthropology? It's something you've talked about in various places. You talk about sacred anthropology, but you also talk about anthropology as a pedagogy of the work. Could you expand on that a little bit for folks?
Yeah. So sometimes when I've met with faculty over the years, I used to have lots and lots of gatherings in our home with faculty, and just for open conversation. And I might propound this question. I would say, I've heard that every pedagogy implies an anthropology. What's yours? And I'm usually agree with silence at this point. It's not a question they've been asked for. And so I clarify, say, look, if you haven't thought clearly about what it means to be human, what it means to be a human learner, what it means to be a human, in our case, adult learner, then your practice isn't grounded. And probably what you're doing is knocking off somebody else's technique without understanding its source, which is pretty much what a Jiffy Lube tech does. And I know as a faculty member and a scholar, that's not what you want to be. So let's talk about the anthropology. What are the big anthropological questions that we should ask as professors in a community college? Things like, is talent rare or really common? Is it really true that some people can't learn math? What is it most important for people to learn? How does learning and personal formation work together? And what's our purpose? Our students each have a story. Is their story really autonomous, or is it embedded in some larger story that we need to understand? So these are examples of really what I think are anthropological questions, and they can get very technical, like what's the best way to learn? or they can get really philosophical, like what's worth learning. But those are questions of anthropology. And the best example is the story of a talk on learning science and how people learn, and with the thesis based on the science that pretty much anybody can learn pretty much anything under the right conditions. And having made that case in Death by PowerPoint, the speaker then greets people after the event, and someone comes up to him and says, I love that talk, and I really like that idea that anyone can learn anything under the right conditions. And I think it's true in most disciplines. And the speaker says, well, what do you teach? And the woman said, I teach German. It's a really difficult language. It's non-intuitive. The syntax is difficult. The vocabulary is odd. It's just alien to so many people. And I can tell you, after 15 years of teaching German, there's some people who just can't learn it. And the speaker says, well, how fortunate for them they weren't born in Germany. And the woman looks at him puzzling, and he says, you know, the rate of learning German in Germany is pretty much 100%. Do you think that's genetic? That there's a Deutsche gene? No, it just happens that the conditions for learning German are really, really good in Germany. The point being, it's an anthropological question that changes your perspective on your practice almost 180 degrees, from presenting material to causing learning to occur. So the old model was, I'm going to put the feast on the table, but if you don't have the appetite or you can't digest it, that's not my problem. And our faculty came to believe, no, my job isn't to present material, it's to create the conditions for learning. And they're a little different for every learner, and that's the challenge. That's an example of an anthropology shaping their pedagogy, right? Well, it turns out that pedagogy is not the only thing that's embedded in anthropology. So every performance review system, every system of incentives, every marketing model, all these things are based on some anthropology. The problem is we haven't examined them. We just accept the model at face value. It's called best practicism. Let's copy the other guy. And very often, the underlying anthropology is at best inadequate, and perhaps worst, diabolical. That humans are manipulable and therefore should be manipulated. They're Nietzschean almost. Mm-hmm. So calling people back to sort of this deeper questions, bring them back to mission, to their telos in the institution's telos, in the society's telos, and so on. And so very often getting back to the source of the conversation, which I would say was the sacred anthropology conversation, helped us get past the politics of institutional practice.
Mm-hmm. Great. So in real time, in practice, are there places that your effort to make this pivot at a place like Valencia College or elsewhere worked better or worse? Could you give examples of where you felt like you were able to create the conditions for learning, or where there were processes and procedures that you felt were pretty sticky and immovable at various times?
Yeah. So I would say, Suzanne, that the low-hanging fruit were the things that we knew we had control over. So as a leader, I could convene a conversation of people who had the power to change the systems that the organization used. Compensation, performance review, induction, hiring, structure of the organization, the ways that we made decisions, the governance of decision making, who's at the table, why are they there, all those kinds of things. That was, in a way, that's the stuff that the technique of management focuses on, and informing that technique with this deeper conversation was useful and productive almost immediately. The harder work is when the institution is behaving in invisible ways, when people get crushed and nobody even knows it.
Yep.
And my favorite example of that is in the book, and it's about a student who came to me to withdraw from class. And I knew her reasonably well. She was in her late 20s. She was obviously upset, and I knew her because she was an ambassador for the president's office. You know, the khaki pants and the blue blazer go out to the community. She was very upset, and she said, "I have to withdraw. So tell me what's going on." She said, "My boyfriend died. We were about to get married, and he was in a car accident. And he's gone. And I've tried to stay in school, but I can't. And I need to withdraw." And we had a cry and a hug, and I said, "Fine." She said, "Well, you understand my financial condition. I can't. I have to have a refund." Well, this is in Texas, and there was a date by which, by law, you couldn't give a refund if they'd been in class that long, and that date had long passed. So I looked her in the eye and said, "No problem. We'll give you a full refund. Bring your textbooks. We'll take care of that. Call my wife. She's the best listener ever. And come back early next term, and we'll give you sort of express registration so you get everything you need." Okay, we hugged and she left. Easy. That was easy for me to do. Okay. Later that day, I'm on a long run with my chief business officer telling him this story. And he says, "You can't do that. It's against the law." And I said, "Well, they'll just have to come get me then." He said, "But there'll be an audit exception." I said, "Great. What's the headline going to say? President helps student." Whatever. And then he said this, "But what are the other people she talked to going to think?" I thought, oh, I wasn't her first thought. So I went to the vice president for student affairs and said, "Did you talk to her?" "Yeah. Isn't it awful?" I told her there was nothing we could do, but she could come see you. And I went to the director of admissions and registrar who knew her and said, "Did she talk?" "Yeah, she talked to me. It was terrible. I told her there's nothing I could do, but she could go see the vice president." So I literally went back to my office, and it was an old-fashioned desk that had a piece of glass on top of it. And in Texas, indoors is where things are cool. And that glass was nice and cold, and I had to put my hot face on the glass and think, I've accomplished nothing here. I felt good about myself, but the institution isn't where it needs to be. A good institution allows people to do good for the right reasons, even with some risk to the institution. I hadn't created a place where good people could do the right thing for the right reasons, fearlessly. And that's way harder to do. So we should do the systems work. We should do the procedural work. We should change policies. I mean, all that stuff has to be done, and we need to be deeply aware of the persons that we're serving while we do it. But we also have to be aware that it cost those people that worked for me something to say no to her when they wanted to say yes. And teaching large bureaucracies like that have accountabilities to the state and to the taxpayers, teaching them how to break the rules is not nearly as easy.
So if you don't mind, how did you tell those individuals that you went ahead and took the risk and said, "This is the right thing to do, we're going to do it," and to begin to enable them to think about how they might do that moving forward? Yeah. Or is that sort of like just a bridge too far?
No. So we had a staff meeting just a day or two later. It was very convenient. And we had them all in the room. And I started the staff meeting by saying, "I owe you all an apology. I put you in a position I never want to put you in again. Here's what happened." They all said, "Oh, no, it wasn't you." And I said, "Yeah, it kind of is. It's kind of us, but I'm the most powerful person in the room with regard to these issues. And I want you to share with me your best thinking on how we can change the institution so it does good habitually, it does good reflexively, and it does good, and it really would have a hard time doing bad."
That's great.
And so it was a long process, but but it started with an apology.
Wonderful. So I wonder if we could talk about a few little tidbits from the book that I found particularly compelling, and just sort of walk through them and get you to reflect a little bit about it. So one of them is, and you've addressed this a little bit, is this notion of leadership as transforming, that it can make you a better person. And you talk about transcendent purpose, and you sort of have a parenthetical definition that talks about courage, love, meaning, and purpose. Could you just expound on that a little bit for folks today?
Well, with your audience, they'll recognize the source. So, I really like Alistair McIntyre's critical argument about modern ethical theory, that it is at a dead end. And it's at a dead end because, for a variety of reasons, we abandoned the only two other possibilities for having a sound ethical theory. One is purpose, telos, and the other is givenness. You might call it revelation, but the givenness of truth. And the radical skepticism of the Enlightenment and modernity sort of rejected both of those out of hand as starting points for moral reasoning. In this case, I think telos is our friend. That deep institutional health, deep human health, and real virtues can only emerge from a sense of purpose. So that Aristotle would say, you test virtue against purpose. Purpose is what causes virtue to be possible. You can't separate virtue from purpose. And in many ways, I think management culture in the 21st century has almost completed that separation, so that it's 100% technique and no telos at all. You can argue that the market is your source of telos. That's hardly telos at all. That's just aggregated interest. So I think, again, a reason for I stayed so long in community colleges is that telos is best expressed in story. And community colleges know their story better than most other kinds of institutions do. And it's a very straightforward story. So connecting virtue, institutional and personal virtue, to story, what's the larger narrative here, I think is so vital for that work.
Wonderful. There's a quote from your book that I've heard versions of it elsewhere, and I actually texted it to a former postdoc as I was reading it yesterday. So it says, the most dangerous thing about communications is the illusion that it has occurred. And I texted it to a former postdoc because she used to say to me, I think you're upset because they can't read your mind. And I would think to myself, but didn't I just say that? And she would have to correct me and say, you didn't even come close to that. So, but could you talk about the role of listening and how it builds character? Because I think it's a super important point.
Yeah. So, again, culturally, we reward noisy people.
Yep.
And I have been one, and have been strongly reinforced for being as noisy as possible. But I rarely learn anything when I'm speaking. And the way our brains are made, we are designed to leap to conclusions. It's just more efficient. And the more responsible you are in the world, the less you can afford that leap, because the consequences of missing it are so much more serious. So I think the most important faculties that leaders bring to the job are, first, hope, and second, the capacity to listen deeply and learn from what they hear. And then the third would be self-awareness. I know who I am and who I'm becoming and what's happening to me. Without those three, technique is just dangerous.
That's great. You have a whole chapter in the book about hope. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about what that is. In the book, you define hope as the conviction that what is happening means something, the struggle matters, the sacrifices and the sweat and the risk have value.
Yeah.
Can you talk about why hope is a particularly important virtue to leadership?
Yeah. So hope has several amazing qualities. The first is that it awakens all the rest of our faculties. People without hope die a little bit every day. And what dies are all the other wonderful things that make them human, like their creativity, their capacity to imagine, their willingness to sacrifice for others, all those sorts of things. And so without hope, what you end up with is sort of the tension of self-interest in institutions, the sort of mutually assured destruction, what sociologists call the refractory nature of our organizations, which are just interests pulling against each other and achieving some kind of temporary stability. Hope allows you to name a place on the horizon you want to sail to together and to start navigating there. You may not agree on the intermediate course to arrive there, but you can negotiate the course if you're clear about the destination, and the destination matters. And if you're a leader who cannot convey the destination and why it matters, then you're a technician. It's not just motivational. We call people to do a lot more than to be motivational. We call them to take risk with their personhood. What are you bringing to work with you every day? And if it's not safe to bring everything to work, or if there's no ultimate meaning to the work we're doing together, then it's an unreasonable ask, really. Rational people won't do it.
Great. That you make these two other points, I think, about risk and about failure, which I think is sort of interesting. One is about performance always falling short of vision. And if it doesn't, then it really wasn't visionary in the first place. And the second one is about risks and failure being inevitable if you're not taking risks. And I think you're really trying to encourage both vision and this notion of risk. Can you talk about the importance of those in leadership? Because I think, especially as we look at the presidential landscape of higher education, I can imagine the next wave of leaders being immensely risk averse.
Yeah. Yeah, the present wave, in fact.
Yeah.
Yes, that's a great question. So let me confess first that first idea was borrowed from a book called Art and Fear, which I highly recommend. It was written by two art professors who were wondering why so many of their best students stopped making art within a year or two of graduating from their program. And so they were speculating, what's the nature of creativity and why do people engage it in the first place, and why do they surrender that part of their lives to something else? It was given to me by an artist on the faculty at North Harris College in Houston, Texas, or Aldine, Texas. She got to know me well enough to know that I was writing poems and music that I didn't perform or publish, and she wanted me to get busy about it. When I read the book, it did encourage me to start going public with my creative work, but every word spoke to me about leadership. So I just substituted leading for art in the book. And that was one of the really important things I learned. Nothing ever satisfied me. Everything fell short. And everything feels like a marginal failure looked at from one point of view. And every good leader I know, when they look back on their career, that's what they discuss. It's, we got so close and we didn't make it. They're full of not really regret, but just the sort of sense, winsome sense that they didn't quite achieve what they'd hoped. And that can paralyze you. But that notion that no, that's a part of the work. What you couldn't sort out on this canvas becomes the beginning point for the next canvas. You keep working the problem, and if you're no problems, then you're probably not producing art. You're producing entertainment. Maybe you're a painter in light. I don't know.
Yeah.
So that's where that came from, and that gives me hope. So what works against hope is nothing ever quite seems finished or complete. That notion, oh yeah, that's a part of the work, is that nothing's perfect. That's what fuels the next investment of creative energy. It's been hugely valuable to me, or I would have retired a lot earlier or gone on and done something. So that's where that came from. I'm sorry, I probably haven't answered the whole question.
No, it's wonderful. Yeah, I appreciate that. The final chapter in the book is about doing good, and I was very taken by the notion that our work ought to be a blessing to others.
Yeah.
I would love you to say a little bit more about that, but then also, is that a generalizable point? Or is the ability to be a blessing to others some kind of privilege of certain kinds of work or not?
That's a great question. And my best source of that is actually Psalm 85. So if you're a practicing Christian, you know the Psalm well, because we sing the front of it. How lovely is your dwelling place.
Yep.
I wish I could stay here like the birds nesting in the walls of the temple. It's just a lovely expression of the joy of worship, of authentic worship. And then the back end of that psalm we often quote in our prayers, because it says, "No good thing will he withhold from those who walk uprightly." It's God's promise of beneficence. The middle of it's a little harder to read. It's a Pilgrim's poem, and it says, "Blessed is the one whose strength is in the Lord, in whose heart are the highways to Zion." It is, who's on a pilgrim's road. "Though they walk through the valley of Baca," which means desolation, "they will make it a place of springs, and the summer rains will water it." As I wrestled through my life over and over again with the notion of calling, that psalm was always the answer. I don't know if God cares what kind of institution I work at. I'm not even sure if my strategic plan is nearly as important as the kind word to the stranger in the elevator today. I don't know. What I do know is that I'm promised that if I'll stay on the pilgrimage, that somehow, not because of me, God will bring blessing to other people. And he may do it through the work itself, which I should try to do. It may come from the associations in the work. It may come from the people served by the work. It may come for people who observe the work. It may come from parents of people who benefit from the work. I mean, we don't know. The cosmic economy is larger and more complicated than we can fathom. But we do know this: if we stay on the pilgrimage, we're promised that even the valleys of Baca can be blessed by our passing through. Today's psalm, this is the third week of Advent, and the appointed psalm in my Anglican tradition is Psalm 94, I think. And it says, it's a promise of harvest. It says, "Remember how we were delivered from Babylon?" This is like 30 years after the delivery. This poem is written. Remember that? There's going to be more Babylons. There's going to be more suffering, but there will also be joy. And if you continue to sow, even if you sow seeds in tears, there will be a harvest. It's that prompt. For me, it started as a theological insight. Oh, this is my vocation in the world. It's not being a college president or an academic or a writer or a poet. My vocation is to be a blessing. And I think that's where we surrender our little story to the larger story that it inhabits. And to those in your audience who are part of higher education, I would say, to me, that's one of the most lamentable losses of the last century and a half in our vineyard. In the face of the challenges of pluralism, we have exiled the conversation about the larger story from the curriculum and from the campus. And it only comes out accidentally. And it ought to be more intentional.
That's beautiful. I just absolutely love that. Hoping before we open it up to questions, we can take a bit of a pivot and talk about your current project and what you're up to right now.
Yeah, I'm going to break all the rules. I'm going to tell somebody about the book I'm working on. I might not finish, which someone else may already have written, or somebody might write faster than I. So the extension of the work for me now is thinking about how this cultivation of virtue that we focus on in our individual lives, and the ethics that we focus on, and morality in our shared lives, might also be an institutional characteristic. So the working title is The Virtuous Institution. And the idea is that organizations are often like organisms. They behave in ways that even the leaders and people that you think are pulling all the strings aren't even aware of. Our systems, habits, cultures, processes, and so on do things that we haven't examined and thought about. And often they do bad things, even to the people that we serve or are supposed to serve. And so, drawing from Aristotle and Aquinas, my question is, what are the practices that we can intentionally embed in institutions that inculcate the predilection to do good, that enlarge our sense of what we were talking about much earlier? We're going to do the right thing, and we're going to be very conscious, self-conscious about it. We're going to stop hurting people even accidentally, and we're going to start doing all the good we can do in every way that we can. How do you grow that inclination, not just in the persons, but in the habits of the institution?
That's wonderful. And are you, much of this current book is based on your own experience. Are you drawing from that well or other exemplars?
Yeah. We'll see. That's the answer to that.
Great.
Yes, I have stories and thoughts from my experience. I'm getting lots of secondhand experience now, vicarious experience by coaching scores of senior leaders, and mostly in higher ed, but also in healthcare and other areas, and watching how they navigate and asking these questions and what they're doing. But it is about that Aristotelian idea. It's not just hope.
Yep.
It's not just a wish, and it's not let's change our thinking so we can change our practice. It's the other way around. So in Nicomachean ethics, Aristotle argues if you want to be a better harper, you have to start playing the harp.
Yep.
And eventually you'll be good. And courage is that way, and mercy is that way, and so on. So I think it's Keith. What is his last name? Faraza, something like that. He's written quite a lot about teams, and he has a paraphrase of that. It says we don't think ourselves into a new way of acting. We act ourselves into a new way of thinking. So my focus in that is on what are the hands-on practices? What are the things we should be doing that leaders can put in place on our institutions that will guard their health, but more importantly, guard their goodness?
Great. I think that's especially important, especially as you complete a book on leadership, because one of the things you note really importantly is changing the leader doesn't suddenly change the culture of an institution, despite what we might think or hope. And so I think bringing these two pieces together is just fantastic. I want to turn to a couple questions. Here's a question from a former Valencia employee. You talked about making decisions based on what's the best for the student. I love how you told us the college is what the student experiences. Can you talk about how you gave permission to staff to make those decisions?
Oh, that's a great question. So having been there over 20 years, the memories muddle, and I can't call a lot of really specific things. Here's the way I remember it, for what that's worth. I would say that it was my job and other people's jobs to constantly say, what do we want the students to experience? So colleges and other organizations. I just got off the line in a consulting gig with another college, and my comment to them was, your strategies are all interesting and they're all about yourself. What you want to do. Tell me, what's your theory about what you want students to experience in each of these areas? And then we'll talk about what you do. So you design to the student experience. If the college is what the students experience and you haven't named the experience you're trying to influence and named how you will know what they're experiencing in that process, then you haven't done student-centered design. And if you're in another business, let's just call it human-centered design. Or client-centered design. It's their experience that matters. The institution can become an idol, and it's actually just a tool.
Great. Next question. I'm a parent to college-aged children. Do you take any advice for, or do you have any advice for cultivating a vision for work in young people who are deciding what to do with their lives, like you have described today, for the good of others as well as formative?
Yeah. Wow. So I think that way better than advice are two other things. Humans actually don't learn much from being given advice. As a coach and consultant, I can really double down on that claim. Advice is cheap and not so effectual. Two things are really powerful. One is story. Humans are story animals. I think that's a part of my sacred anthropology. When we say in the beginning was the word, I think you could say just as accurately, in the beginning was the story. The word, remember, the universe was spoken into existence, whatever we mean by universe. And there's a feminist poet I like a lot used to say that the universe isn't composed of atoms, it's composed of stories. So story is really powerful. Stories are, they're about fictive language, about talking about things that aren't real to you right now, that you can't touch. So I would engage in lots of storytelling with your children. That is, get them to tell you stories that matter about themselves, about their future. Make it fun and free and easy. Let's imagine that it's 10 years from now and you chose to go in the direction of X. What do you feel like? What are you enjoying every day? What is your life like? What do you regret? Use story. And of course, there are other people's stories. The second thing that's way more effective than advice is experience. Mm-hmm. So if you want your children to think deeply about the future of their working lives, get them to work. Get them to volunteer. Get them to work in different environments. Get them to work with poor people. Get them to work with complicated systems. Put them in different places for work experience, and then help them process it. There are not many things I agree with John Dewey on, but one is learning occurs by reflection on experience. And I do agree with that. So get them to work and then talk about it.
Wonderful. Thank you. Next question. Do you think that personality influences the virtues, vocations, and character to lead in education?
So that's an interesting question. I'm not sure I have an accurate definition of personality. I think that's a problem for psychology still. What do we mean by that category? But if you mean that the individual sort of characteristics, are some people more likely to be leaders or to be appreciated as leaders than others? And I would say we have cultural preferences that may or may not serve us. And so we tend to love the extrovert, or the person who can at least appear to be an extrovert. We love people who are articulate, persuasive. We really prefer people who are, but whatever definition we have at the moment, pretty. We have a lot of cultural content in our assessment of other human beings, and I think we miss a lot of talent in that process. I think I'm more interested, was always more interested in finding out kind of what makes a person work on the inside, and what unique gifts they brought to the team. And so looking for people who are really thoughtful, or folks who listened really well, even if they didn't speak all that well. People who had character traits that are going to be with them for their lifetime, rather than skills that can change in a matter of months. So personality, I think of personality as the frame around the painting, not the painting.
Great. Let's try to squeeze in one last question if possible. Thinking about the larger landscape of colleges and universities, if America goes to college at the community college level, what role should complex, old universities and institutions aim to fill? In what ways can these older institutions contribute to the formation of students and faculty, and not their malformation?
Yeah, good question. It's a hard question to answer, because the strength of the American higher education environment, I wouldn't call it a system, but the environment is its plurality. There's so much diversity of institutional mission. The weakness is that that everybody seems to be regressing to a particular mean. So the way that prestige informs institutional aspiration is homogenizing that aspiration. So let's just talk about big public institutions for a moment. Most states had what they used to call a flagship, maybe two, and then regional institutions. And for a whole variety of reasons, the institutional aspirations that endure in those regional institutions divorce them from the regions that they were created to serve over time. And they all seem to aspire to be something else. So I'm thinking of a regional institution in my state that used to be deeply connected to 29 counties. And now they've decided they want to be the William and Mary of our state. And I ask why. And the answer is, well, the trustees like the idea. You can probably raise more money doing that. And you can attract better, quote unquote, faculty if they think this institution will help propel their careers to where they really should have been hired in the first place, which of course is the Ivy League or whatever. So that kind of institutional identity crisis that we have is a problem. If I had my druthers, I would say we should stop thinking so much about the identity of the institutions and more about the missions that they can best serve. And they will be served in regions, most of them, of the, depending on what you include, 3,000 to 5,000 institutions. There are only probably 100 that you would call global institutions. There are another 300 or 400 that want to be, even if you excluded them. And so, all right, what about the other 2,500 to 4,500 institutions? They should think in terms of the ecosystem that they're in, which is an ecosystem of institutions, including their regional community colleges and their private independent college partners and their public partners and so on. They're part of a larger ecosystem that ought to be asking the question, where is the intersection of the greatest need in our region and our capacity to serve? How do we do that? That's the strategy to pursue. And I would just say and I do say this to presidents around the country, if your vision statement starts with who you want to be, you have no vision. You only have ego. The vision statement's about the impact you want to make on other people's lives.
Great. And with that, I just want to thank you. This hour completely whizzed by, but I know we've all been enriched by it. I want to put in an enormous plug for Leadership in the Crucible of Work. It's a wonderful read. Completely enjoyed it. We're going to have to get you back because we didn't even get to talk about music or poetry, which I think, yeah, so for our next conversation. So thanks to everybody who joined us today, wishing everybody the very best of holiday season. And as we turn to 2025, I just wanted to extend a special thanks to our very small but mighty Virtues and Vocations team, including Erin Miller and Sam Dean and Judy Benchar when she can be torn away from her other obligations. I could not be more grateful for their extraordinary work and especially for the joy that they bring to it every day. So hope you can all join us in 2025, the year of the snake. Our very first conversation will be with co-authors Tom Smith of Catholic University and Anna Moreland of Villanova, who will be talking about their great new book on January 2027 on the subject of adulting, which we could all use some tips on. So anyway, Sandy, this was a real treat. I so appreciate you taking time, especially at this busy time during Advent.
Thank you. It's a privilege to be here. Thank you very much.
Great.